Superhumanize. Accelerated evolution.
Welcome to Superhumanize. Today, we're diving deep into one of the world's leading minds in cognitive and evolutionary psychology, Professor David C. Geary, a Curators Distinguished Professor at the University of Missouri. David has reshaped our understanding of how evolution molds everything, from mathematical cognition to the nuanced differences between male and female brains. He's the author of groundbreaking works like Male, Female, The Evolution of Human Sex Differences, and The Origin of Mind, challenging us to reconsider what we really know about intelligence and behavior. Imagine if the way you think, learn, and even interact was written into your very biology. What does that mean for our future, for education, and for the way we see each other? Today, we unpack those provocative questions and more. Get ready for an enlightening conversation that will stretch your mind and spark new insights into the power and potential of human evolution. Dave, welcome to the Superhumanize podcast. It's great to connect with you today.
Great. Thank you, Ariana. I appreciate it very much.
Absolutely. And Dave, would you do us the favor, the pleasure of telling our audience a little bit about yourself for those who have not taken a deep dive in the fields that you're extremely well known for yet?
Okay, sure. I'm a Curators Distinguished Professor at the University of Missouri in Columbia. I study a variety of things, sex differences, human and some non-human stuff, study mathematical development and a variety of other things. My wife locks me in the basement in the morning, so I have nothing else to do.
You are a very humble man, a very accomplished man, as I also mentioned previously in the introduction, and you have done some really fascinating work, particularly, Dave, your work on the evolutionary origins of cognitive abilities, as you laid out in your book, The Origin of Mind. That has really provided a fascinating framework for understanding how our brain has evolved to handle complex tasks, problem solving, and intelligence. The way you explore the evolutionary pressures that have shaped our brain's ability to generalize information resonates with a lot of current research, such as, I hope I pronounce his name correctly, Stephen Mithen's work on cognitive archaeology. And so I'm curious to hear from you, given how humans have evolved under both social and environmental pressures, do you believe that there are certain cognitive abilities that actually remain underutilized in our modern societies?
Yeah, great question and great topic. And maybe someday I'll revise that book. But the argument is that one of the important selection pressures for the evolution of our cognitive abilities was dealing with people, the competing interests of other people, trying to gain status, wealth, resources, because it is clearly linked to survival, reproductive options in traditional societies, obscured in modern societies now, but it's there. And I focused on the ability to generate mental models. So you can think about yourself as you are now, and you can imagine yourself in the future, say 3 years from now, or 5 years from now, or 6 months, whatever it might be. The ability to generate a model of potential future states seems to be evolutionarily novel. Chimpanzees might be able to do it, but the time scale is much shorter. So we can think ahead about where we want to go and then start to problem solve about how we're going to get there, and use probably what's called the default mode network in the brain that gives us a self-referential understanding of our experiences and our memories and where we are now. And there's another network that kind of works with, they interact at times, called the frontal parietal network, and that's involved in external attention, but also problem solving and thinking through things step by step. So I think you have to outwit others. So you need to understand what other people are thinking, planning, doing, etc. And then you need to generate model of those dynamics, a mental model. So you want somebody to do something for you that they don't really want to do. So you can generate, if you know them well enough, their counter arguments for why they don't want to do it or whatever. And then you can begin to mentally strategize about how to deal with those counter arguments or counter strategies that they might have, so forth. So I think generating the mental models and wanting to use those to problem solve and get ahead in the world is really critical. What's different about I didn't really have a lot of network stuff in Origin of Mind because a lot of that came after it was published. But if we look at the anatomy of these networks compared to chimpanzees and monkeys, we see that humans have much more integration of them in the frontal areas. Basically, it means we're able to turn these systems on ourselves rather than just them reacting to experiences. And that is giving us the ability to generate these future-oriented models and problem solve. So it's a lot going on in this area, a lot of discoveries, a lot of things I need to update. But I think social competition is really critical, kind of consistent with what a lot of other people have argued.
And how do you see how do you integrate, for example, the theories, hypotheses, or the research based on the social competition with the research, the theories, the hypothesis on the collaboration model? Can those go hand in hand? Like we also talk about, it's not black or white, it's black and white. If we want to move away from a more Western view of the world to a more Eastern model.
Sure. More collaboration, cooperative sort of things. Yeah, that's exactly right. To get ahead or to have a safe life or whatever, you need the cooperation of other people. It's often a group experience. You build up coalitions, social capital, and so forth. So clearly, cooperation is absolutely necessary in this. And our cognitive skills allow us to generate larger groups than we see in any larger cooperative action-focused groups than we see in any other species. So that is definitely part of the hypothesis and part of the model. The interesting thing about human cooperation and the source of a lot of arguing, academics just argue about everything, is that one view, the black-white thing, is that we are designed to be cooperative, noble savages, sort of things, and help each other and all of that. The other view is the self-serving, self-interested view of things. And they're both wrong in the sense that your self-interest involves cooperating and developing relationships with other people. The difference between humans and other species where we see like eusocial insects, like wasps and stuff like that, where the argument is we're like them. Everybody cooperates together to build the nest and defend it and so forth and all that. The big difference that I think a lot of people miss is the eusocial insects, the cooperation is obligate. They don't have a choice. They're going to be workers or defenders or queens or whatever they're going to be there. Humans are facultative cooperators, meaning they cooperate depending on the circumstance, depending on the situation, depending on whoever else is there. So yes, we are great cooperators, but it's very fluid.
Yes. Yes, Dave, and I think it's important what you pointed out. It is not because of our inherent nobility that we have this capacity and that we also did and still do put such a focus on cooperation. It is because it helps us survive. And it is also why in certain indigenous societies still today, it is one of the most harshly punishable things to do, for example, to hoard food, secret away food versus sharing it, because that has a negative impact on the survival of the tribe, as it used to have for us when many tens and thousands of years ago, we were, I don't know, roaming the steppes or the forest. So it's important to point that out. The cooperation is not based on because we are so inherently good. We also are, and we also have the capacity to do not so good things, but it is because it enhanced our survival. So looking at some of these things that still not just linger, but still drive us a lot of times today, how can we harness these abilities to better address contemporary challenges. Let's talk the complexity of the vastly quickening technological evolution or global problem solving.
Yeah, I think the political class, unfortunately, has a tendency to divide people in ways that garner them votes, developing in-group, out-group sorts of things, and that undermines cooperation. Certainly, you can get around that, but it involves highlighting shared interests. It could be national interests, it could be regional interests, it could be global interests, or whatever it is, rather than dividing people up into in groups and out groups, which destroys cooperation between them. People have to understand that it's not a zero-sum game, and cooperation can, depending on who you're cooperating with, can be beneficial to both of you or all of you if it's a bigger group. And that sometimes isn't apparent, and sometimes our chattering class disrupts that for their own political gains.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. And I think it's also still the misunderstanding of certain things like the survival of the fittest, to bring Darwin into the discussion, where it's not, he never meant the survival of the most brute who subjugates the most people, but it was, if I remember correctly, and please, Dave, correct me if I don't, it was the ones us to actually procreate and survive. And I think what Darwin also mentioned was that basically the group, the community, the tribe with the most empathetic or willing to cooperate members, whatever that decision to cooperate was based on, whether it was truly somebody who meant well or somebody who just saw the advantage of it, right? Yeah. And in your work to go more into this of competition and cooperation, and your work often focuses on competition, particularly amongst males, as a key evolutionary driver. How, when we look at research that talks about how cooperation, particularly if we look at game theory and Robert Axelrod, where it suggested that cooperation is just as critical as you also just said, Dave, how can we balance these inherent impulses or hardwiring for both competition and cooperation? And first of all, how can we balance that and not just react? And then also, I'd like to hear your take on what you think on today's world, which is highly interconnected, whether cooperation may become the more evolutionary advantageous strategy for us.
Yeah, it's absolutely true that cooperative organized groups are going to outcompete disorganized groups where there's a lot of internal fighting and other types of things. I do focus on male competition, and males are very focused on status. And this is true across cultures, and status could be making a lot of money, having a big herd, having big agricultural yields or field or whatever it might be. Status is important, and it's very consistently related to how marriable the guy will be and how many kids he has and how many survive. So it's been well linked to reproductive outcomes. It's disrupted a bit in modern societies, but in traditional societies, it's there. So we know the status striving is important. But status striving also involves typically cooperation in a larger group. You have to be part of a larger group that is organized, they support one another, they like one another. They're not talking about their feelings or doing things that women tend to do in their support groups. They're focused on some type of outcome that will benefit all of them. Some might benefit more than others, but they all will get something out of it. And so the action-oriented organization of men that will yield an outcome that is respected and important in their culture will get guys together and increase cooperation. Actually, guys can be extremely cooperative and helpful and supportive under those contexts with each other.
Yes, and I've observed something interesting, Dave. So I personally have co-founded a women's circle. We've been meeting twice a week and actually making this model even bigger and looking to expand it internationally and it's been very interesting to see the benefits of women meeting regularly. aside from their female or male friendships and groups. And I've also observed that there is a movement to also bring men together, which I think is extremely healthy and supports things that you may not get when it's mixed somehow, or when it's just one single other male or a single other female. There's something that gets activated scientifically, for example. When women get together, apparently a lot of oxytocin is released, much more so than if you even have when you, unless maybe you meet your very best friend and it's just an emotional high. And for men that get together, certain things are activated, including also the release of more testosterone. So I find this really, really very interesting. You, Dave, you've conducted some groundworking work. We just started to talk about it on evolutionary psychology, particularly regarding sex differences. And your work has also had significant influence on the field. So it's very clear to me that evolutionary forces have shaped many behavioral patterns over millennia. And also, when we look at contemporary society, we see a significant flexibility in human behavior, especially as cultural forces rapidly evolve. You've mentioned it before that certain things, not so much, things have shifted a bit. We know that behaviors that before have been thought to be deeply ingrained, such as, for example, very gender-specific roles, are shifting across cultures, and cultural expectations can drastically modify gender behaviors, even overcoming certain evolved predispositions. Looking at this cultural flexibility and also the neuroplasticity, how do actually these rapid behavioral shifts that are driven by cultural forces, how do they interlink with the slower moving evolutionary predispositions?
Yeah, great question. There's a lot going on there that we don't fully understand, but there's a couple questions there. I'll talk about men's groups, women's groups, and then cultural effects. I've argued that women, and other people have argued it as well, need to form or are biased to form social support groups. So they'll have a few friends together and it's social emotional support, and also for getting feedback about stuff. So-and-so said this, and it's ambiguous what it means. What do you think? Rehashing things and teasing things apart. I think women are very good at that and do that because when they compete with each other, it tends to be very subtle and manipulative within whatever social group they're in. And it takes more work to decode things, and it's good to have a friend. And also in traditional cultures, women need help with parenting and other things to deal with. And so developing a network of close friends is very important to their mental health. And in traditional societies, the health of their children. It is critical for women to do that. Men's groups are a little bit different. Actually, they're quite a bit different. Men's relationships are not the same as women. But as I said, they can organize themselves into pretty large scale groups without much effort, actually. And they develop friendships within those groups. And those groups are typically focused on doing something, building something, competing with another group of guys, or watching sports on television, whatever it is. They're organized together, and that they develop their friendships. And it's very important for men to do that. And that in traditional cultures, particularly if there's warfare or large-scale agriculture or whatever, there's a lot of cooperation among them. In modern societies, a lot of those pressures, the neighboring town isn't going to raid your town, and you do other types of things. So the pressures for men to organize themselves into activity-focused groups is lessened as things get easier in life. And I think it's had the negative effect of guys drifting apart, doing their own things, which is not healthy for them. I think having men's places where they can come together and build something or do something together with just guys there would do a lot for their mental health, social functioning, and so forth. But it's different than what women would do, which is fine, but it is.
Absolutely. And I agree with you, particularly with regard to the mental health aspect. I see it in my contemporary or older generation male friends where they are not in the habit of actually meeting up with men's communities or men's groups that they have a very tough time talking about what's going on, talking about what's weighing them down, and then often it moves into self-soothing. Often it's maladaptive, like it can be alcohol, it can be junk food, it can be gaming or other things. And where I see, and it's just because I think the feedback that also is given via social media, there's more of an openness, not a judgment behind it. I see that some of my younger male friends, they're actually very active in male groups. And as you said, they go and do things and build things. And they also just are together and they are in a safe space where they feel like they can actually bring up things that are bothering them, whether it's in the workplace and relationships, stuff they're working through themselves. And it's provided not just an outlet and a relief, but the men who engage with men's communities are actually thriving, much more so than those that have relegated themselves to be the lone wolf and everything is always okay. I don't need anyone. I can just do this on my own. It's not very healthy.
Women have an internal bias to generate these social support networks themselves. So they're actively trying to develop these relationships and friendships and so forth. So they have this network. Guys' networks come together when there's some external threat or something they need to do, build a barn or whatever it might be. And if you remove those kind of needs for coordinated action, there is a tendency, especially after they're married and older, for the guys to drift apart and have their own spaces, which is good to have their own spaces, but they're not having the spaces to do just the men's activities. And so which is very unusual, but you have men's groups and activities in other more traditional cultures that work together, they hunt together or do warfare together, whatever it is together. So they maintain that even into old age. But in the modern society, when a lot of these threats are there, the drifting apart is a risk.
Yes, very much. And that results in loneliness, not just mental loneliness, emotional loneliness, but also support network, especially as you get older. That is really important. And if you don't have a close-knit family, that's of the utmost important for survival and having good life, to actually consciously go and seek or create these networks. That's also what I always advise, whether it's male or female friends. That is a fundamental thing if you want to live well and live well long. Dave, you have actually explored how historical evolutionary roles shape modern gender dynamics, and it's compelling, and especially in the light of technological advancements that we've seen in the post-industrial societies. With now what we're seeing is a shift towards knowledge-based economies. Traits that we traditionally associated with women, like collaboration and empathy, are becoming increasingly valued in leadership and other professional roles. Do you think the evolutionary basis for gender roles can remain as relevant in an economy where physical strength and competitive aggression are becoming differently important, if not in some aspects lesser important?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, clearly there are cultural shifts in the relative importance of trait A or trait B or whatever it might be. And there's evidence that, of course, preferences and so forth can change. There are certain things that just stay constant, but there are other things that do change. One of the things that I've looked at with some colleagues and think about a lot is the sex difference now in higher education.
Mm-hmm.
And we see that in Europe, the US, Canada, a lot of developed countries where now we have many more women in higher ed than men. And that's good for women. They're getting educated, which is going to increase their employment prospects, wages, and all of that sort of thing. But it's really going to disrupt, I think, the marriage market, so to speak, because women want guys that make as much or more than they do, or higher status, or at least the same status, and so forth. But when we have 3 women to 2 men in that kind of white collar knowledge base category, that really increases the competition among women and decreases the motivation of these guys who are doing well to settle down and get married. And so we have age first marriage is getting older. marriage rates are going down. There's a lot of dynamics there that are new and due to the differences in schooling. Guys just don't like schooling as much as girls, and that's true all the way starting in first grade.
Yes, and also something I also want to talk about just in a minute, the schooling and the schooling system. And what you pointed out is really important. So it's absolutely great that women are achieving more, becoming more independent financially, intellectually, and are able to do, at least in our countries, things that in some other countries they still are not, or it's even punished severely if it's even attempted. I would be curious to learn, and I've actually been looking into this, what can be done to level the field. Obviously, the solution is not to dumb women down, take opportunities from them. I think when I look at my female peers and also the many groups I'm part of online, a lot of these women, maybe I'm sitting in an echo chamber and it's a particular type of highly educated, financially affluent woman, but the kind of females that I am exchanging with actually do not necessarily have a bias against men who do not have a similar education or a similar income. They actually would be quite open to be with a man who doesn't necessarily earn the same or earns less, who's had a different education. Because let's say if you are you don't have to be a professor, you don't have to be an attorney, you may be a businessman, you may be a plumber. What they do seek, though, is men who have done certain type of work, internal work, and where the men themselves are capable of thinking outside of these structures, as in, I need to be the main breadwinner. So they're looking basically for, I don't really like these labels, but for kind of an evolved male who is very secure in himself, emotionally in what he does, and who also can be eye level with a woman who may have a different type of education, a higher education, and may bring in more money. So that they are actually very open to oftentimes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think in the U.S. about 16% of couples, the women earns more than the guy. A couple things going on there with the schooling, higher ed. Guys have poor reading abilities, which can be addressed with schooling, and is one of the things that is probably, even for technical fields, maybe a bit of a stumbling block for them. They don't like to read as much and they're not as good at it. And if you go to college, even if it's in a engineering, you're gonna have to read. And so that is one issue. Another issue that's happened in the United States and parts of Europe, and maybe even happening now in Germany, is the loss of high-paying blue-collar manufacturing jobs.
Yeah.
With the opening of world trade, and especially China joining the World Trade Organization, it really decimated these jobs. And they require a lot of spatial, mechanical skills and physical skills that guys are really good at and they like. And so these are things that are really good fit for them. And now, because of macroeconomic changes, a lot of guys that would be doing that, making good income, feeling good about themselves, having probably male friends at work and all of that, a lot of that's just been taken away because of these macroeconomic changes. And so that has really disrupted things as well. Yeah, with the women's preferences, one of the things that does change across cultures is the guy's personality and behaviors and stuff. In a traditional culture, if you're a pastoralist or agricultural culture or whatever, the women are really looking for a reliable, conscientious guy who's going to go out and do whatever he needs to do, even if he's not very chatty or interpersonal at home. They would prefer that, but they'll do with the just conscientious guy. In the modern world, and in those societies, the men and women are better networked with their kin. So they already have built-in relationships and stuff that they've had their whole life. In modern societies, people often move away from their kin groups for jobs or education or whatever it is. So they're more isolated than people typically are. And so when marriages are formed or long-term romantic relationships are formed, this now becomes a more primary source of social support and companionship and so forth that wouldn't be necessary in a lot of traditional contexts where you have your uncles and cousins and your aunts and nieces and that sort of thing where you would have that network. So what you're saying fits well with that, where women that are independent and so forth and are going to be living away from the support network that they grew up with, at least to some extent, are really looking for a companion and somebody that they can have a long-term friendship with, not just somebody who's going to go out and do his job and whatever. So we do see those shifts in preferences with changes in broader economic activities.
Yes, and I see these shifts. I see a lot of the positive. I also see the possible problems that can arise. And when we also look at cultures, I think the Chinese are reaping the problems from their past one-child policy. And of course, male fetuses then were preferred, female fetuses were aborted. So in a lot of regions, they are dealing with a surplus of men, where there's even stories circulating of women being stolen or basically abducted into other areas. This, of course, is a very dystopian scenario, but it's a stark reminder that we need to do what we can to balance basically the playing field. What are some things that you think could be done? And especially looking at AI and how many of these manufacturing jobs and other things that were typically more male dominated are falling to the wayside or will fall to the wayside soon.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things going on there. Worldwide trade has benefits to a lot of people, reduces conflicts between countries and usually lowers prices and so forth. But I think people that have looked at the kind of the macro level stuff haven't fully taken into consideration how it affects like manufacturing jobs in their local regions and so forth. So there's, okay, open trade, we're going to make more money and blah, blah, blah. But it's decimating towns and industries and so forth in certain areas. And that, of course, is creating lots of problems. So I think their policies probably need to take that into consideration more. That, yeah, free trade is good and we want to generate money and all of that, but we need to look at the local consequences of that and how it's going to affect things. Maybe we need to pay higher prices to keep some of these jobs there. At the same time, I also think that men have a personal responsibility to figure out how to do whatever they need to do to be successful in life. So there is politicians and so forth need to take an consideration to provide opportunities that are going to work. And the guys need to figure out what those opportunities are and move forward with them. There are actually a lot of high-skilled blue-collar jobs now, working mechanics, air conditioning, all of that sort of thing. Takes a year, 2 years of technical training, but they actually pay very well, and they can't be outsourced. And so there's a lot of those opportunities there that don't get emphasized in normal school settings because it's all reading and general academics. Used to be, you'd have shop and mechanics and so forth in school settings that a lot of guys would do. And a lot of that has gone to the wayside because there was so much emphasis on college is great, you got to go to college and blah, blah, blah. But we lost something else, these high skill training for the high skill blue collar trades. And so getting more guys into those sorts of things, making them available, and maybe changing your normal high school curriculum to go back to providing those opportunities, emphasizing those more than it is. College isn't for everybody, and it's probably not for most people, but having some type of technical skill is important.
Yes, for sure. And I like your emphasis on also the self-empowerment, to not just rely on outside sources, politicians and policies, but to actually seek solutions to problems, which is also something that men are very good at, and to remove ourselves from this disempowered state. Speaking of schooling, it has always struck me, I was somebody who got by without doing much and still got the grades that I needed. I never really enjoyed school. I found it absolutely boring in most cases, unless there was really passionate teachers that, of course, were able to connect with the students. And it's just the idea of where you look at children, boys and girls alike. So you stick them into a controlled environment at a very early time of day until the early afternoon, and they need to sit still and learn, where children want to move and explore and do things. It's just nuts to me. And then especially when you also talk about little boys who like to do certain things, little girls like to do certain things, sometimes it overlaps. But our schooling system clearly is not made for the innate drives of children to thrive. So what kind of school in an ideal world do you envision, knowing what you know, Dave?
Yeah, thanks. Great question. I've done a lot of thinking and work on schooling, and basically schools are cultural inventions or evolutionarily novel contexts that have been developed over time to prepare students for a modern world. Teach them how to read, teach them some numeracy skills, some general geography, or whatever the knowledge is. This is not the type of knowledge that kids would develop in traditional societies, where they would develop social skills or navigation skills and do whatever's important in their culture, typically through observational learning and engaging in it with older kids and adults. Sitting still, reading and listening to teachers is a completely novel context. And so it's difficult for a lot of kids. It's not what they're designed to do. It's more difficult for boys because they are physically more active and move around more, run more, get together in groups and so forth. And so sitting still and paying attention is hard for both sexes, but it's more for boys. It's a tough question though, because they still need to learn how to read. They need numeracy skills. They need a variety of other skills, an understanding of science, literature, and so forth to be successful in the modern world. So we can't get rid of schools. They have to be there, and we can't make them super fun, because if you make them super fun, then kids are going to engage in things that they want to engage in, usually talking with their friends and playing and that sort of thing, which helps them develop some types of skills, but it's not going to help them learn to read and write and so forth. So there's a trade-off there. But I think schools could be better at accommodating some of these differences, maybe with more frequent recesses, even if they're shorter, where everybody can get out, the girls can get out and the guys can get out and they can do whatever they're going to do, rather than being forced, so to speak, to really pay attention to something that was not very interesting. So I think you can break things up. Maybe you can integrate there's been some work looking at teaching math and other types of concepts by framing them in an evolutionary perspective, like family relationships or groups competing or other types of things, to give you a sense of like sets. People you're related to is one set, not related to is another set. Those that you're friends with and so forth, not related. Maybe you have a overlapping Venn diagram type of thing. So you can put things in an evolutionary frame to set up an understanding of math concepts or other types of things. There's some interesting work going on there in that now that seems to be helpful for motivation, but they still have to learn the math. There's no easy solution to it, but I think there's tweaks that could make it easier or better.
Yes, for sure. And I was always somebody who had a great affinity for languages, for history, I also loved biology and, of course, literature. A dear friend of mine, she was the complete opposite. Everything that I loved bored her. She excelled in mathematics and physics and other things that I just didn't have such a connection with as she had. I think learning is also a very individual thing for most, and obviously we can't as of create a curriculum for each individual student, but maybe with the continuous development of AI it will be possible. I don't know if that'll be all good or have a lot of things that are actually the opposite of benefits. But talking about differences, something that I found really interesting in your work, Dave, is your research on the evolution of vulnerability, particularly as it relates to sex differences and health outcomes. And that has actually provided some really important insights into why men and women may face different health challenges across their lifespans. Now, can you tell us a little bit more about that, please?
Yeah, so the basic argument is that when you have an advantage, it comes with the associated vulnerability. So think of it this way. If you have a 2,000 square meter house or apartment or flat, whatever, versus a 1,000 meter or 500 meter, it takes more resources to build the 2,000 meter to get it done. And it takes more to maintain it, to keep it warm in the winter or cool in the summer or whatever it is. So it's more costly if you're better at it. And so if you run out of money to pay your heating bills, you're going to feel it sooner in the bigger house than in the smaller one because you can't maintain the temperature in the larger houses easily. So my argument is that, yeah, women are better at some things, men are better at other things. We're talking about cognitive types of things. But that leads to prediction of if things go wrong, that these advantages are going to disappear or maybe even reverse. So I'm working with some colleagues right now on finishing up an article on this where we looked at, in this case, height, and we looked at it across countries. And we had UK data looking at it across generations from 1900 to 1958 or so. And generally, men are bigger than women for evolutionary reasons related to competition. But to get big, you have to be healthy, you have to have a lot of calories, good nutrition, and so forth during the preschool years and during adolescence. So if this leads to a vulnerability in height, then we should see smaller sex differences in height, the difference between men and women in difficult contexts. And as things get better, health gets better, nutrition gets better, lower stressors, and so forth, the sex difference should become bigger. And we have great evidence for that. That is, in fact, the case. So if you look at nations with a lot of health, a lot of disease burdens, a lot of parasites, poor nutrition, and so forth, both men and women are shorter, but the effect on men is bigger, at least for this trait. And so as things get better over time, over the last 20th century, and as things get better within nations and across nations, the gain to men's is about double the gain to women. So women may pick up 2 or 3 inches, men will pick up 5 or 6 inches. So the gap gets bigger. And the other way to look at it is as things go wrong during development, the advantage that men have shrinks. And we see that we're going to move now to cognitive types of things. Other studies have shown. So if we look at something where women are better, verbal memory, episodic memory, remembering the details of what happened, some verbal fluency types of things, but especially episodic memory, you get the same pattern in really difficult contexts where there's a lot of stress, disease, and other types of things. Their advantage is gone. But as conditions improve, they spread out. The women get better at these things. And the men get better at visual spatial types of things. So we're trying to look at that in more detail now. That's our next project. But the bottom line is, as things get better, the body gets healthier, taller, better. The brain must be developing more appropriately and closer to its potential than would otherwise be the case. And as we get that, the prediction is that sex differences in certain things, some favoring women, some favoring men, will get larger. And that's based on another, and that's part of an evolutionary theory, but that's the vulnerability there. If you're really good at that, if something goes wrong, the big elaborate trait is the first to go.
And when we talk about not the longer term, the evolutionary processes and a few generations, the effects from one generation to when the parents may have had a better time, better access to food, to clean water, etc., than their children do not, and how that affects the children. If we just look at an individual and looking also at societies where personalized medicine is becoming more prominent, more accessible, do you think research such as yours on sex differences can actually support more effective and tailored healthcare interventions for both women and men? And are there specific areas of health, let's say cardiovascular disease or mental health, where these evolutionary differences could be especially relevant for developing new treatment strategies?
Yeah, great question. I don't know for sure, but I've suggested that sex differences in these traits could be a good biomarker of the health of the population. So if you have a population where both men and women are shorter and the difference between them in height is small,
Mhm.
or even sometimes reversed, then I think that would tell you that there's really something wrong going here. So something bad. There are problems within this population. I've suggested that also that things that women are better at, some of the verbal fluency, episodic memory, and so forth, may be the first to go with things like Alzheimer's or other forms of dementia. So if we look at the elaborate traits and say, okay, we can possibly pick it up sooner. The problem is that people don't think that way, and there's no sex-specific norms for a lot of these things. So the women do better. You throw men and women together, and it's okay, they look fine. It's just like if you threw men and women together and took an average height and then looked at a guy and say, oh, he's just average. No, he's not. He's well below average for a guy of his age. And so there's a problem there. So if we had sex-specific norms for these specific skills, I think it is potentially more sensitive at picking up early cognitive decline and disease and so forth than the standard batteries that they use now.
Yes, and I think that is for all over health of individuals and also populations, the right steps are taken now. I hope it all takes a hold more sooner than later. Dave, this has been really fascinating conversation. There's so many topics that you are just so deeply immersed in. What is on the horizon? What are you currently focused on that really excites you? What can we expect next?
Yeah, I'm excited about, as I said, we have this data on the height and the changes in height across countries and across generations. It's actually pretty amazing environmental change. And now we have some data sets where we can look at the cognitive stuff as well. Question is, okay, as the heights change and the sex dimorphism gets bigger in that, suggesting a healthy population, does women's advantage in episodic memory forceful experiences actually get bigger? And do men's advantages in visual spatial skills get bigger? Do women's advantages in reading facial expressions get bigger there? And if we can show that, then, and if we can show it's related to these height differences, which is a biomarker of early health, we'll have good evidence that, yeah, changes in cognition across generations is not simply due to schooling, that the early health and development is really, and it'll have a biological foundation to it.
Yes. Mhm.
So that's the next task. We also have a large scale. In my other life, I studied math development.
Mhm.
We have in a previous longitudinal study, we looked at 3-year-olds all the way through first grade. We identified basic math skills and quantitative knowledge that predicts readiness for first grade. And if they're behind in a couple of key areas, they start well behind at the beginning of first grade and they don't catch up.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so we're trying to figure out, okay, what's driving these individual differences? Why are some kids getting it early and some kids not getting it? So we're looking at how the parents talk to them about numbers and stuff. We're looking at parents' math anxiety, going into their homes multiple times, looking at their
Mhm.
actual math achievement. Then we're looking at the kid factors. We're also observing them in schools, in classrooms, and looking at what the teachers are presenting to them, how they're behaving in classrooms. Are they paying attention? Are they're little kids? Are they jumping around and so forth? So we're it's a huge project, and we're still collecting data, but I think it'd be very useful for eventually identifying and developing interventions for these at-risk kids.
Absolutely, because so many kids suffer as they're going through school, either in a minor way, such as myself. I just never could really get connected with mathematics, something I in my adult life regret, because once you move beyond the basic mathematics, it is so fascinating what you can get into. And it'll help resolve a lot of problems. So that's really great work, Dave. So glad you made time for us today. For people who want to connect with you deeper and learn more about you, or perhaps even connect with you, how can they do so?
Thank you, Ariana. I very much appreciate it. Great conversation. I'm impressed. You know a lot. You prepared. That's perfect. Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, don't really do social media. I did set up a Substack, Straight Talk about sex differences, and it's basically just a republication of some articles on sex differences I published in Quillette. And so they gave me permission to put them there, so it's not behind a paywall. So I cover there's 6 or 7 of them, covering a variety of different issues, from sex differences in the brain to father engagement and stuff. So there's a few things there, and people can always email me at my university address, and I'm happy to respond to questions or send articles or whatever the case might be.
Excellent. And I'll make sure to mention that in the show notes. Again, Dave, much gratitude to you. And it's been wonderful to take a walk in your brain today.
Yeah, great talk. I appreciate the questions, very thoughtful and super.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful rest of your day.